Hello, and welcome back to Transforming the Mind. I'm going to get right into it. We're still on Chapter 2. The 7-point cause and effect method. Before we can apply the 7-point cause and effect method to ourselves, we need to cultivate a sense of equanimity towards all sentient beings, which is expressed through the ability to relate to all others equally. To do this, we need to address the problems of having thoughts and emotions that fluctuate. Not only should we try to overcome extreme negative emotions like anger and hatred, but also in this particular spiritual practice, we should try to work with the attachment we feel to our loved ones. Now, of course, in this attachment to loved ones, there is a sense of closeness and intimacy, as well as an element of love, compassion, and affection. But often these emotions are also tinged with a strong feeling of desire. The reason for that is rather obvious, because when we relate to people towards whom we feel deeply attached, our feelings are highly susceptible to emotional extremes. When such a person does something that is contrary to our expectations, for instance, has a much greater potential to hurt us than if the same thing were done by someone to whom we do not feel that close. This indicates that in the affection we feel, there is a high degree of attachment. So in this particular spiritual practice, we try to level out the attachment we have to certain people so that our sense of closeness to them is genuine and not tinged with desire. The key point to this preliminary practice of equanimity is to overcome the feelings of partiality and discrimination that we normally feel towards others based on the fluctuating emotions and thoughts associated with closeness and distance. It really seems to be true that attachment constrains our vision so that we are not able to see things from a wider perspective. Recently, I was at a seminar on science and religion in Argentina. One of the participant scientists made a point which I think is very true. His name is Maturana. He is the mentor of the neurobiologic Francisco Varela, whom I have known for a long time. He said that it is very important for research scientists to adopt the methodological principle of not being emotionally attached to their field of inquiry. This is because attachment has the negative effect of clouding and narrowing your vision. I totally agree. This is why, through the practice of equanimity, we try to overcome these feelings partially so that we can deal with everything and relate to everyone even-handedly. In this respect, I would like to add how much I appreciate the general Western emphasis on objectivity, at least in the intellectual field. However, I do also detect a major contradiction here, because when I talk to people of various professional backgrounds, particularly from the West, they seem to have a tremendous amount of attachment to their own profession. One could say that many people seem to have an enormous personal investment in their profession. They identify with it so much that they feel as if their profession is so vital for the world's well-being that if it were to degenerate, the whole world would suffer. This suggests to me that their level of attachment is inappropriate. Tsongkhapa, the great Tibetan master, once said that some people have a tendency to pick up one grain of rice and then, on the strength of an observation they make on it, conclude that all grain in the whole universe are just the same. Likewise, some professionals appear to have that kind of extreme attachment to their own narrow perspective. So there seems to be a contradiction between these two aspects of the Western mentality. When we practice developing equanimity, sometimes it is helpful to use visualization. For example, you can imagine 3 different individuals in front of you: someone who is very close to you, someone you regard as an enemy, and whom you dislike, and then someone who is completely neutral and to whom you feel indifferent. Then let your natural emotions and thoughts arise in relation to these three individuals. Once you are able to allow your natural feelings to arise, you will notice that towards the loved one, you feel a sense of closeness and also great attachment. Towards the person you dislike, you may feel hostility and a sense of distance, and that towards the individual who is neutral, you will hardly feel any emotion at all. At this point, try to reason with yourself. Why do I feel such different emotions towards these three individuals? Why do I feel so attached to my loved ones? You might begin to see that there are certain grounds for your attachment. The person is dear to you because he or she has done this and that for you, and so on. But if you then ask yourself whether those characteristics are permanent and whether the person will always be like this, then you may have to concede that this is not necessarily the case. Someone may be a friend today, but turn into an enemy tomorrow. This is especially true from the Buddhist point of view, when we take many lifetimes into an account. Someone who is very close to you in this life may have been your enemy in another. From this perspective, there are no real grounds for feeling such strong attachment. In the same way, then turn your attention towards the person you dislike and ask yourself, on what grounds do I feel such negative emotions towards this person? Again, this may be because he or she has done certain things towards you, but then ask yourself whether that person is likely to remain your enemy all his life. And then, if you take into account the question of many lifetimes, you will realize that the individual may have been very close to you in a past life, so his status as your enemy is merely short-term. You begin to see that there are no justifiable grounds for having such extreme hatred and anger towards that person. Finally, consider the individual in the middle, to whom you feel totally indifferent. If you raise the same kind of questions again, you will realize that the person may have very little relevance to your present life, but may have been important to you in another life in the past, and even in this lifetime. He may become important to you at some future point. So this type of visualization helps to level out the extreme fluctuating emotions that you feel towards others, and to establish a stable basis on which you can build a more balanced sense of closeness. Gyaltsab Rinpoche has given a wonderful analogy to explain this point. He compares equanimity to fertile soil and a leveled ground. Once you have plowed a fertile field and leveled the ground, you water the soil with the moisture of love, and then you can plant the seed of compassion. If you nurture it continually, then the young shoot of bodhisattva, the altruistic intention, will naturally grow. I think this is a beautiful metaphor. If we think along these lines and question our emotions from various angles, then we come to appreciate that the extreme emotions that we tend to feel towards others and the behaviors they generate are perhaps unwise. Alright, this one's called Thinking of Others as Someone Dear. Having developed equanimity, we can begin the first stage of the 7-point practice, which is cultivating the attitude of thinking of all others as being as dear to you as your mother or father or friend. Here, of course, the teachings take into account the idea of beginningless lifetimes. So all other sentient beings are considered to have been our mother or father or friend at one point or another. This is the way we try to relate to others and to develop a genuine sense of connection. The reason this practice is traditionally considered so important is because, in nature, it is predominantly mothers who play the most critical role in nurturing and bringing up their offspring. In some animal species, both mother and father remain together to look after their young, but in most cases, it is just the mother. There are some exceptions, of course, There are some species of birds where the mother hardly participates at all in the building of the nest. It is the male that works hard to build the nest, while the female just looks on and inspects the results. It then seems quite fair that the male takes greater responsibility in the nurturing process. However, such cases are rare. Butterflies offer another interesting example. The butterfly lays her eggs, and there is no possibility that she will ever meet her offspring when the caterpillar emerges. Yet despite this, she makes sure that the eggs are laid in a very secure area with a food supply, natural protection, and so forth. We cannot say that such animals have compassion in the sense that we understand it, but whatever the reason may be, whether it is a matter of biology or chemical process or compassion, the fact remains that the mothers go to enormous lengths to ensure the safety and well-being of their young. It is for these reasons that traditional Indian and Tibetan texts single out mothers as an example of how we should relate to other beings. In fact, the Tibetan language has coined a special term for dear old mother sentient beings, and the expression has become so deeply embedded in people's psyche, it has a poetic ring to it. Nowadays, however, people raise gender issues in the content of Tibetan culture. I tell them that, for me, the whole idea of mother sentient beings and the Tibetan expression that goes with it is a good example of how motherhood was valued in Buddhist culture. The expression for dear old mother sentient being, Ma Jen Sem Chen Tam Chi, has a powerfully poetic and rather sentimental ring to it. Whereas if you tried to coin a similar expression with the male pronoun Pa Jen Sem Chen Tam Chi, it doesn't sound right at all. In fact, dear old father in Tibetan has a derogatory connotation of someone who is rather naughty and irresponsible. In the traditional literature, it is understood that this profound recognition of all sentient beings as being like one's mother is based upon the notion of successive lifetimes, so the whole question of rebirth and past lives comes into the picture here. The Buddhist teachings emphasize the need to understand the possibility of rebirth on the basis of understanding the nature of consciousness. The point is made, as we saw earlier, the consciousness is a phenomenon that arises due only to a previous moment of consciousness. Matter cannot become consciousness, as regards the connection between mind and matter generally. One can contribute towards the causation of the other, but in terms of an individual continuum, consciousness must be caused by a preceding moment of consciousness. These days, everybody talks about consciousness and mind, thoughts and emotions, and so on. But in Buddhism, consciousness is specifically defined as that which is of the nature of mere luminosity and knowing. It is the facility of knowing and of basic awareness. It is fine to talk generally about these things, but I personally feel that a real understanding of what we mean by consciousness can only come from the basis of experience. I don't think that intellectual discussion or verbal discussion alone can convey the meaning of consciousness. In my view, an experiential understanding of consciousness or mind is invaluable. In the Tibetan tradition, we have different teachings to assist us in developing an experiential understanding of what is meant by consciousness or awareness. The Dzogchen tradition, for example, has a practice of observing the nature of mind, where you begin with a sense of wonderment, then allow your thoughts to arise, and in that neutral state, observe the activity of the mind. Similarly, in the Sakya tradition of the union of profoundness and clarity, one observes the nature of mind by allowing the mind to rest in its natural, uncontrived state, and then observing its activity. In the Jaluk and Kagyu traditions, too, there are practices of Mahamudra, the Great Seal, for identifying what is meant by mind. If you engage in such practices, and if, as a result, you have some experiential sense of what is meant by awareness, then when you try to understand the beginningless continuum of consciousness, it will make some sense to you. Otherwise, the mere statement that every instance of awareness must be preceded by another instance of awareness cannot be very conceiving. You need personal experience to appreciate its significance. Reflecting on the kindness of all beings. The second element of the 7-point cause and effect method is reflecting upon the kindness of all beings. In your meditation, you focus on the kindness of others, especially in the content that they have been your mother in this or other lifetimes. And this naturally leads to the thought, I must repay their kindness. I must acknowledge the profound kindness they have shown to me. Such feelings will arise naturally in someone who is honorable, ethical, and what we could call civilized. Once you recognize all other beings as your kind, dear mothers, and then naturally you will feel close to them. With this as a basis, you should cultivate love or loving kindness, which is traditionally defined as the wish to see others enjoy happiness. And then you also develop compassion, which is the wish for others to be free of suffering. Love and compassion are two sides of the same coin. Exchanging and equalizing oneself with others. Alright, just seeing how long it was, sorry. Exchanging and equalizing oneself with others. We will now turn to the other method for transforming the mind, which is exchanging and equalizing oneself with others. Here again, the first stage is the cultivation of equanimity. Although the meaning of equanimity is the context is different from the one we spoke of earlier, here equanimity is understood as the fundamental equality of all beings, in the sense that just as you have the spontaneous wish to be happy and overcome suffering, so does every single other being in equal measure. Now we try to probe deeper to understand what this aspiration to be free of suffering really implies. It does not arise from a sense of self-importance or self-congratulation. Such considerations simply do not play any role here at all. This basic aspiration arises in us simply by virtue of the fact that we are conscious living beings. Together with this aspiration comes a conviction that I, as an individual, have a legitimate right to fulfill my aspiration. If we accept this, then we can relate the same principle to others, and we will realize that everyone else shares this basic aspiration too. Therefore, if I, as an individual, have the right to fulfill my aspiration, then others, too, have an equal right to fulfill theirs. It is on these grounds that one has to recognize the fundamental equality of all beings. Within the practice of equalizing and exchanging oneself with others, this is the equalizing stage, where we develop the understanding that we and others are fundamentally equal. The next stage involves reflecting on the shortcomings of excessively self-cherishing thoughts and their negative consequences, as well as reflecting on the merits of developing thoughts that cherish the well-being of others. How do we do this? We begin by comparing ourselves with others. We have accepted that there is a fundamental equality between ourselves and others in terms of our respective aspirations to be happy and overcome suffering. We have also recognized that all beings, including ourselves, have an equal right to fulfill that aspiration, no matter how important an individual person may be, and no matter how unimportant. in a worldly sense, others may be. So far as the basic fact of wishing to be happy and overcoming suffering is concerned, there is absolute equality. So what is the difference between us? The difference is really a matter of numbers. No matter how important an individual is, the interest of that individual is the interest of only one being, whereas the interest of others is the interest of an infinite number of beings. The question is, which is more important? Simply from the numerical point of view, if we want to be fair, we have to accept that the interest of others is more important than our own. Even in the mundane world, we know that the issues which affect the lives of many people are generally granted greater significance than those that affect fewer people or a single individual. So logically, one has to accept that the well-being of others is more important than one's own. To be completely rational or objective, one could say that sacrificing the interests of the many for the sake of one person is an unwise and foolish act, whereas sacrificing the interest of one individual for the benefit of an infinite number of others is more rational, if such a choice is necessary. Now you might think that all of this sounds fine, but at the end of the day you are you, and others are other. If self and others are totally independent of each other, and there is no connection whatsoever between them, then perhaps there is a case for ignorance, the well-being of others, and simply pursuing one's own self-interest. However, this is not the case. Self and others are not really independent. In fact, their respective interests are intertwined. From the Buddhist point of view, even when you are unenlightened, your life is so intertwined with those of others that you cannot really carve yourself out as a single isolated person. Also, when you follow a spiritual path, many spiritual realizations depend on your interaction with others. So here again, others are indispensable. Even when you have attained the highest state of enlightenment, your enlightenment activities are for the benefit of others. Indeed, enlightened activity comes about spontaneously by virtue of the fact that other beings exist, so others are indispensable even at that stage. Your life and the lives of others are so interconnected that the idea of a self that is totally distinct and independent of others really does not make any sense. Although this is the reality, it is not reflected in our behavior until now. Regardless of reality, we have nurtured within ourselves a whole complex of self-cherishing thoughts. We believe in something that we hold very dear, and we regard as precious, something that is like the core of our being, and this is accompanied by a powerful belief in our existence as an individual being with an independent reality. The belief that there is a substantial real self and the cherishing of one's own interest at the expense of others are the two main thoughts and emotions we have nurtured within us throughout our many lives. But what is the result of this? What benefit does it bring? We are continually suffering. We are continually experiencing negative thoughts and emotions. So our self-cherishing hasn't really got us very far. Also, if we shift our focus from ourselves to others and to the wider world, and if we turn our attention to all the crises in the world, all the difficulties, the sufferings, and so on, we will see that many of these problems are direct or indirect consequences of undisciplined negative states of mind. And where do these come from? From this powerful combination of self-centeredness and the belief in our independent existence. By shifting our attention to the wider world in this way, we can begin to appreciate the immensely destructive consequences of such thinking. These attitudes are not helpful, even from one's own selfish point of view. We might ask ourselves, what benefit do I, as an individual, derive from my self-centeredness and from the belief in my existence as an independent self? When you really think deeply, you will realize the answer is not very much. In fact, these beliefs are the source of suffering and misery, even for the individual. The Buddhist literature is full of discussions on this. Interestingly, about 2 years ago, I was at a medical conference in America, and a participating psychologist presented the findings of research he had carried out over a long period of time. One conclusion he considered almost indisputable was that there seems to be a correlation between early death, high blood pressure, and heart disease on one side, and a disproportionately high use of first personal pronouns on the other, I, me, and mine. I thought this finding was very interesting. Even scientific studies seem to suggest that there is a correlation between excessive self-cherishing and damage to one's physical well-being. Incidentally, now a phrase has been coined in the Tibetan, Nega Nija Rinpoche, which means I, the precious one. Although it sounds a bit strange, it is quite an interesting expression. Now, in contrast, if you shift your focus from yourself to others, extend your concern to others, and cultivate the thought of caring for the well-being of others, then this will have the immediate effect of opening up your life and helping you to reach out. In other words, the practice of cultivating altruism has a beneficial effect not only from the religious point of view, but also from the mundane point of view, not only for long-term spiritual development, but even in terms of immediate rewards. From my own personal experience, I can tell you that when I practice altruism and care for others, it immediately makes me calmer and more secure. So altruism brings immediate benefits. The same applies when you cultivate the understanding that the self is not really an independently existing entity, and begin to view self instead in terms of its independent relation to others. Although it is difficult to say that merely reflecting on this will produce a profound spiritual realization, it will at least have some effect. Your mind will be more open. Something will begin to change within you. Therefore, even in the immediate term, there is definitely a positive and beneficial effect in reversing these two attitudes and moving from self-centeredness to other-centeredness, from belief in self-existence to belief in dependent organization. To summarize, I agree with Shantideva when he writes, "What need is there to say more? The childists work for their own benefit. The Buddhas work for the benefit of others. Just look at the difference between them. If I do not exchange my happiness for the suffering of others, I shall not attain the state of Buddhahood, and even in samsara I shall have no real joy. The source of all misery in the world lies in thinking of oneself. The source of all happiness lies in thinking of others." This goes on to questions. Question: if wisdom and compassion are the natural characteristics or qualities of the enlightened mind, why do we have to work so hard to cultivate them? Answer: let us take a simple case like a seed. We all know that the seed has a potential to grow into a plant. As long as we put it in the right soil, fertilize it, give it moisture, maintain a certain temperature, and so on. Although we all accept that the seed has the potential within it, there is a complicated process involved. A lot of nurturing goes into making sure that the seed grows into a fully grown plant. It's the same with us. Another reason is because the negative aspects of our mind are so ingrained. Question: how do we distinguish between selflessness and passivity? Answer: I think it's important to understand that when we talk about altruism and about others' well-being, we should not imagine this means totally rejecting our own self-interest, neglecting ourselves, or becoming some passive nonentity. This is a misunderstanding. In fact, the kind of altruism that focuses on the well-being of others comes about as a result of a very courageous state of mind, a very expansive attitude, and a strong sense of self. So much so that the person is capable of challenging the self-cherishing, self-centeredness, that tends to rule our life. In order to do that, we need to have a strong sense of self and genuine courage, because these tendencies seem too deeply embedded in us. This is why I normally tell people that a bodhisattva, a person who embodies this altruistic ideal, is paradoxically someone who has a very strong sense of self, because without it, he or she cannot have the level of commitment and courage. So you should not think that the altruistic intention that we are talking about is a mere passive state of making pious wishes. Question: when Your Holiness talks about controlling emotions in the West, that can sometimes mean a repression or suppression of emotions. How do we approach this practice with a lightness of mind? Answer: of course, it's very true that sometimes suppression can be negative and destructive, particularly if the feeling of resentment or anger is associated with some painful experience in the past. Under these circumstances, expressing emotion can be freeing. There is a Tibetan proverb which says that if a conch is blocked, you can clear it by blowing into it. In Buddhism, there is an understanding that certain forms of emotion, which are related to past experiences of a painful kind, are better expressed. But generally, what seems to be true, at least from the Buddhist point of view, is that negative emotions like anger and hatred are such that the more you reinforce them, the more you reinforce them, the more powerful they become. If you don't recognize that their nature is destructive, and if you relate to them as if they are natural aspects of the psyche that simply come and go, letting the process take its own course, then that kind of unchecked relation to negative emotions can actually make you more and more prone to emotional outbursts. On the other hand, if you have a clearer recognition of this destructive potential, that very recognition can itself have an effect so that you begin to distance yourself from them. Gradually, their power will begin to decrease. Question: why are positive thoughts and emotions to be preferred and encouraged over negative ones? Are they not equally impermanent and lacking in independent existence? Answer: the reason why positive thoughts and emotions are to be preferred and encouraged over negative ones is that, although they are both equally impermanent and equally devoid of inherent existence, the fact remains that negative thoughts and emotions lead to suffering and painful experiences, whereas positive ones lead to happiness. And happiness is what we all wish to achieve. Both happiness and pain are changing all the time, too. So, if you use the logic, there is no need to seek happiness, and no need to make an effort to relieve ourselves of suffering. If they are both changing from moment to moment, then we can just lie down and wait for the change. I don't think that this is the proper way. We should deliberately try to implement the things that cause happiness, and whatever causes suffering, we should deliberately try to overcome. Question: on the spiritual path, we try to abandon self-cherishing, but in the West, many people don't love themselves, even to the point of developing chronic depression and committing suicide. How can we deal with these issues? Answer: the way I understand it. Oh, hang on, I'm going to take a drink. The way I understand it, the whole concept of self-hatred does not mean that the person does not love him or herself. I actually believe that at the root of self-hatred there must be too much self-cherishing or too much attachment to oneself. One's expectations of oneself is so high that when that is not met, there is intense frustration, which sets up a negative dynamic. I think it's very important not to misunderstand what is meant in the Buddhist teachings by the idea of overcoming our self-cherishing attitudes. We are not saying that a spiritual practitioner should completely ignore or abandon the goal of self-fulfillment. Rather, we are advising him or her to overcome that small-minded selfishness that makes us obvious to the well-being of others and to the impact our actions can have on them. It is this kind of selfishness that is being targeted, not the kind of selfishness that seeks fulfillment of one's deeper interests. In fact, you may remember that bodhisattva is defined as the altruistic intention to become fully enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings. So that ideal rests on an acknowledgement that the attainment of full enlightenment is necessarily not only in order to be capable of benefiting others, but also for the perfection of our own nature. Bodhisattva therefore implies to recognition of the need to fulfill one's true self-interest. In fact, in the Buddhist teachings on altruism, we're really suggesting that we should ignore our own self-interest and abandon it altogether. Then logically, this would imply that we should not work for the benefit of others either, because according to Buddhism, one of the byproducts of helping others is that you also benefit yourself. So that would mean that we should work neither for others nor for ourselves. Also, if we look at the classical Buddhist literature on bodhicitta, we find, for example, in the Sublime Continuum, that Maitreya states that all sentient beings are perfectly equal and that they all possess the Buddha nature. This means that we all have the seed of the kindness of the Buddha and the compassion of a Buddha towards all living beings. And therefore the potential for enlightenment and for perfection lies in each one of us. The point of teaching this is to install the practitioner with a deep sense of courage and a strong sense of purpose. If that were not the case, then engaging in contemplations about the fundamental equality of all beings would be pretty pointless. Question. Sometimes the anger I feel has its basis in fear. When I get angry, I feel more powerful. And then I am not afraid anymore. How should I deal with this? Answer. That's very true. We all have the experience. You feel some kind of courage or power when you are angry, but actually it is a blind power. The energy of anger may not be so constructive, or it might simply be destructive. It's uncertain which way it will go. Extreme anger could eventually lead you to even to taking your own life, and that is very foolish. So it is a blind energy. If you are clearly aware of how harmful anger is, then try to look at your anger more from that viewpoint. It also depends on the object of your anger. For example, if it is directed towards an individual person, then you could think about some of the positive qualities of that person, which could help to reduce your anger. On the other hand, if your anger is the result of a painful experience you have undergone, or in connection with some world crisis or disaster, then of course there are some justifiable grounds for it. Even so, if you think it through carefully, no real benefit is gained by getting angry. Question. Your Holiness, it was edifying to read your views on the tragic situation in Kosovo. Would you mind giving us your opinion on whether you ever feel violence may be justifiable as self-defense in the case of an individual or on a national scale in the content